The Saturday my son-in-law pulled up with a locksmith. He was smiling. Not the polite kind of smiling you do when you see family. The wide, loose-jawed kind that people wear when they've already counted the money and spent it twice over in their heads. He had on pressed chinos and a quarter-zip pullover, standing at the end of my driveway with his phone, aimed at my front door like he was filming a property walkthrough for Zillow. Which, I would later learn, was almost exactly what he planned to do. "Time to get your things together, old man," he called across the yard, loud enough that the Hendersons 3 doors down definitely heard it. I've been patient, real patient, but today's the day. The locksmith beside him, a young kid, maybe 25, already looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth, stared down at the concrete and adjusted the strap on his tool bag. I was standing on my front porch. I had my coffee. It was 8:13 in the morning, and the October air up here in Asheville, North Carolina still carries that edge to it, the kind that tells you summer is genuinely finished. The dogwoods along the fence line had gone red and orange. Barbara had planted every one of them the first autumn we moved into this house, 31 years ago. She chose them herself, drove 40 minutes to the nursery in Weaverville, carried them home in the back of our old Bronco with the tailgate half down. I looked at my son-in-law. I looked at the locksmith. Then I did something that visibly rattled my son-in-law more than anything else I could have done. I took a slow sip of my coffee and said nothing at all. "My name is Clifton. I am 63 years old, and I spent 31 years working as a forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service, specializing in financial fraud detection and tax evasion cases. I have sat across the table from some of the most convincing liars in the state of North Carolina and methodically dismantled every fiction they constructed, document by document, line item by line item. I retired 2 years ago, 4 months after my wife Barbara passed from ovarian cancer. I live in the house we built our life in, on a half-acre lot in West Asheville. I have one daughter. Her name is Claudia. She is 38 years old, and she sells luxury real estate in Charlotte. She married my son-in-law 9 years ago. I paid for the wedding. Welcome to Molten Vengeance. If stories like this one hit close to home, stay with me. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you in the comments. When someone in your own family turns on you, is your first instinct to confront them immediately? Or do you go quiet, watch carefully, and build your case before you ever let them know what you know? Tell me below. A note before we continue. Some names and identifying details have been changed for privacy, but every word of what happened is real. To understand the Saturday morning on my porch, you have to go back to a Wednesday night in early May. I know the exact date because I remember checking the weather app before bed and seeing a frost advisory. I had Barbara's rose bushes to cover. I was in my study working through a crossword and half watching a documentary when my phone rang. It was Claudia. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the sound of her voice, that specific catch in the throat, that breathing pattern. I've heard my daughter cry her whole life. Real crying sounds different from performance crying. I recognized the performance immediately, though I didn't let that knowledge harden me the way it should have. Daddy. She only ever called me that when she needed something significant. Jasper and I are in real trouble. We need to come see you, tonight. They arrived 45 minutes later. Claudia had clearly done her makeup before she started crying, a detail I didn't register at the time. My son-in-law looked rough, unshaved, eyes red, wearing a fleece jacket with the collar popped. He dropped into a kitchen chair like a man carrying a tremendous weight and pressed his palms flat on the table. The story came out slowly, in pieces. His commercial development company, he bought and renovated small commercial properties, sold them to investors, had run into a catastrophic legal dispute. A former partner was claiming 50% ownership of 3 properties my son-in-law had developed independently. The lawsuit had frozen all of his corporate accounts. His line of credit with his primary lender had been suspended. They were 60 days behind on their Charlotte mortgage, and the bank had informed them that morning that they would not extend any further financing without substantial collateral backing. "We're not asking for money, Dad," Claudia said, reaching across the table and covering my hand with both of hers. Her fingers were cold. "We're asking for something temporary, something the bank can see on paper so they'll release the hold and give us time to fight this lawsuit." My son-in-law leaned in, his voice measured, almost rehearsed. He explained that what they needed was simple. If I allowed them to temporarily transfer management authority of my home and my investment accounts into his LLC, the bank would recognize the asset backing and approve an emergency bridge loan. Just 90 days, he said, just long enough for his attorney to resolve the freeze and restore his own liquidity. After that, everything reverted to me automatically, clean and documented. I told him I needed to think about it. Then Claudia did the thing that bypassed every rational process I had. Mom made me promise, she said softly. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her hands. In the hospital, the last week, she made me tell her that you wouldn't be alone, that if something happened, if you needed someone, I would be there. Her voice broke on the last syllable, just enough. She was so afraid of you being by yourself, Daddy. I need you to be there for us the way she was always there for everyone. Barbara had been the emotional center of our family. And yes, in the hospital, in those terrible final days, she had made me promise things. Hearing our last conversations weaponized and redirected at me across my own kitchen table, I didn't identify it as weaponization. Not then. I just felt the grief swell up and swamp everything else. I told them to come back Friday with the paperwork. The man they brought with them was introduced as their CPA, a heavy-set fellow named Morton who wore a too-tight blazer and moved through my kitchen with the nervous energy of someone on a deadline. He set a thick binder on my table, 40, maybe 50 pages, and opened it to a tabbed section near the front. My son-in-law walked me through it efficiently. Asset Management Transfer Agreement. Temporary LLC designation. Standard language for collateral restructuring, he said. He pointed to the yellow tabs where I needed to sign or initial. I asked a few questions. The answers were smooth and immediate. I was tired. I was grieving in the quiet, constant way that doesn't announce itself, and I trusted my daughter. I signed. I never saw what was buried in the middle of that binder. The first signal came 6 weeks later. I was at the kitchen table with my morning coffee when the mail arrived. Among the usual envelopes was a piece of correspondence from the Buncombe County Register of Deeds office. It was addressed to my son-in-law's company, care of my home address. The subject line referenced a property tax assessment update. I set my coffee down. In 31 years of financial fraud investigation, I learned that legitimate transactions rarely generate misdirected mail. Misdirected mail is almost always a symptom of a filing error, or a filing that was never meant to be seen by the original owner. I called Claudia. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, and when she did, the background noise told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. The clink of silverware, the ambient hum of a high-end restaurant, my son-in-law's laughter somewhere nearby. Claudia, I said, I'm looking at a piece of mail from the Register of Deeds. It's addressed to your husband's LLC at my address. Can you explain that to me? A pause. She lowered her voice slightly, the way people do when they step away from a table. Dad, that's just administrative. Part of the collateral documentation. It's routine. The bank required the filing to register the asset association. What filing specifically? I don't know the exact terminology. Jasper handles all of that. I really can't talk right now. We're celebrating because the court lifted the injunction. The freeze is resolved. The loan came through. Her voice carried the brightness of someone who has just been handed a gift and wants everyone to feel as light as she does. I'll call you tomorrow and explain everything. Don't worry about the mail. She hung up. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I went to my study, unlocked my desk drawer, and pulled out the binder they had left behind. I had made a copy before returning it, 31 years of professional habit. I started reading every page, not skimming, reading. It took me 4 hours to find it. On page 29, sandwiched between a 7-page indemnification clause, a section of LLC formation boilerplate, was a 2-page document with a title block I almost missed, because the font had been reduced slightly from the rest of the binder, small enough to blend in, not small enough to be obvious. It was a warranty deed, signed by me, transferring full ownership of my property to my son-in-law's holding company. Not management rights, not a temporary collateral designation. Ownership, my house, gone. I did not call Claudia. I did not call my son-in-law. I went to the kitchen, poured cold water over my face at the sink, and stood there for about 60 seconds with my hands gripping the counter edge. Then I sat back down at my desk and did what I spent 3 decades being paid to do. I pulled every financial statement I could access. My investment accounts, a brokerage portfolio I'd built over 25 years, worth just over $380,000, had been liquidated 9 weeks ago. The funds had been wired in 2 transfers to an LLC account registered under my son-in-law's company umbrella. The authorization on file was a durable power of attorney bearing my signature. The same day those transfers cleared, the warranty deed had been recorded at the Register of Deeds. They hadn't just taken my house and hoped I wouldn't notice. They'd taken my house, drained my investment accounts, and filed everything cleanly with the county before the ink on my coffee cup was dry. I sat in my study until past midnight, building the timeline on a legal pad. The detail that kept returning to me was that misdirected piece of mail, that single administrative oversight. Someone using my home address for my son-in-law's new asset was the only crack in an otherwise airtight construction. Without it, I might not have opened that binder again for months. The next morning, I made one phone call. His name is Theron Bascom. He is a trust and estates attorney in downtown Nashville who spent 15 years before private practice working civil fraud cases for the state attorney general's office. I had worked alongside him on 3 occasions during my IRS career when our investigations overlapped. He is methodical, deeply careful, and does not raise his voice. He does not lose cases he prepares properly. I sat in his office for 2 hours. I laid out the timeline, the documents, the wire transfer records, the deed. I watched him read everything twice before he said a single word. When he finally looked up, his expression was not what I expected. He wasn't horrified. He was professionally quiet, the way experienced attorneys get when they recognize something familiar. "The power of attorney," he said. "Let me see the execution page again." I slid it across his desk. He studied it for nearly a minute. Then he set it down. "The notary acknowledgement on this document is defective. The acknowledgement block identifies the county as Mecklenburg, but the notary commission number on file with the state belongs to a notary who has been registered exclusively in Wake County for the past 6 years. She has never held commission in Mecklenburg." He explained what that meant slowly and clearly. For a durable power of attorney to be legally valid in North Carolina, it must be properly notarized. A notarization bearing a false county designation is a void acknowledgement. The POA was, on its face, defective and legally unenforceable. Every transaction executed under its authority was void. But Theron wasn't finished. He turned back to his computer, typed for a moment, and then turned the monitor to face me. "I pulled your property record going back 5 years," he said. "Can you explain this filing from October 2020? I leaned forward. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. Then I remembered. 2 months after Barbara was diagnosed, when we understood what the prognosis actually meant, we had sat down with an estate planning attorney and restructured everything. Barbara had insisted. She was a practical woman in the most profound sense. She loved deeply and planned carefully. She was terrified of what grief might do to my judgment after she was gone. She had seen it happen to other people, watched good men make terrible decisions in the fog of loss, and she was determined to protect what we had built together from exactly that kind of vulnerability. We established an irrevocable Medicaid asset protection trust. Every asset I owned, the house, the investment accounts, the land, had been transferred into that trust. The trust held legal title. I was the beneficiary. A neutral corporate fiduciary served as trustee. Under North Carolina law, assets held in an irrevocable trust cannot be transferred, encumbered, or conveyed by the beneficiary. A power of attorney executed by the beneficiary carries no authority whatsoever over trust property. I had no legal power to sign away what I didn't legally control. My son-in-law had filed a warranty deed and liquidated accounts against property I was structurally incapable of conveying. The deed was void from the moment he recorded it. The wire transfers were fraudulent. And because both transactions involved a federally chartered brokerage and an FDIC-insured bank, every move he made crossed the threshold into federal financial fraud. Theron folded his hands on the desk. "Your son-in-law didn't just steal from you," he said. "He stole from the federal government. He used forged authorization to liquidate accounts held by a federally regulated institution. That is wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1343. The penalties start at 20 years. I sat with that for a moment. "What I need to know," I said, is whether my daughter understood what was in those documents. Theron leaned back. That, he said, is the question that determines whether she is a witness or a defendant. I drove home in the early afternoon and stood in my kitchen for a while, looking out at the yard. The dogwoods were starting to lose their color by then, October bleeding toward November, the leaves going thin and brittle at the edges. I knew what I needed. I needed to hear my daughter speak candidly, without the performance, without the manufactured grief and the borrowed memory of her mother. I needed her real voice, on record, before we moved a single legal piece. I called her that evening and told her I wasn't feeling well. I mentioned that my heart had been giving me some trouble, fatigue, some chest tightness, and that I'd appreciate it if she came up this weekend for lunch. I kept my voice slightly frail, the way it gets when I haven't slept. She said of course she would come, of course. She was sorry she hadn't called more. The following morning I drove to an electronics retailer and purchased a voice-activated micro-recorder. No larger than a thumb drive, designed for professional dictation work. That evening I tested it in different positions around my kitchen. It picked up conversation clearly from 12 feet away. When Claudia arrived Saturday morning, she brought a bakery box and wore a camel-colored wool coat with deep exterior pockets. I made coffee. I shuffled through the kitchen with a slightly uneven gait I'd been quietly practicing. I called her sweetheart twice, and once referred to something from the previous spring as though it had happened last week. She tilted her head with practiced, patient sympathy and gently corrected me. I nodded as though I was uncertain about the timeline. At some point, I excused myself to use the bathroom. I was gone for approximately 90 seconds. When I came back, I set a plate of cookies on the table and resumed the conversation. The coat she had draped over the back of a kitchen chair now contained a micro-recorder in its right exterior pocket. We talked for an hour. She was careful throughout, warm, attentive, nothing remarkable. When her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen, her expression shifted just slightly. She said she needed to step outside to take a call. I waved her off. She went to the back porch and slid the glass door mostly shut. I did not go to the door. I didn't need to. She was outside for 6 minutes. When she came back in, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air. She stayed another 20 minutes, hugged me at the door, and told me she'd call during the week. I retrieved the recorder that evening. I listened to the back porch call in my study, the room dark except for the desk lamp. The call was to my son-in-law. Claudia's voice was entirely different out there, lower, clipped, the warmth completely absent, the performance set aside. He is so far gone it's almost sad, she said. He called me by Mom's name twice. We don't need to worry about any kind of contest. He couldn't put together a coherent legal challenge if someone handed him the paperwork and a pen. A pause, the sound of her husband saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then her voice again, flatter this time. He keeps mentioning his heart. If we make sure his prescription refills stop routing through the Charlotte pharmacy and switch them to a mail-order account we control, he'll run out of his cardiac medication within 6 weeks. At his age, with his history, nobody's going to ask a lot of questions. We'll be completely clear of any challenge before spring. I sat in the dark for a very long time after that. The grief I felt was not for myself. It was for the little girl I had held in the delivery room the night she was born. The child I had carried on my back through Pisgah National Forest on summer weekends, her small hands gripping my collar while she laughed. The young woman I had danced with at her wedding, while Barbara stood at the edge of the dance floor, with happy tears running down her face. I grieved for who my daughter had once been, and I understood, with the cold clarity that comes after grief does its full work, that she was no longer that person in any way that mattered. I transferred the audio to a secure encrypted drive and called Theron that evening. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment after I finished. That changes the nature of this case substantially, he said. The financial fraud is federal. What you've just described is conspiracy with potential intent to do bodily harm. I'm contacting the FBI's white-collar crimes field office in Charlotte first thing in the morning. Not yet, I said. Clifton. I want them to come here first, I said. I want my son-in-law to stand on my property and tell me to my face that this house belongs to him. I want it witnessed, documented, and completely unambiguous before we move. Can we make that happen? Another pause. Then yes, we can make that happen. They came on the third Saturday of October. I knew they were coming because Theron's office had obtained a preservation order on my daughter's phone records, and we had been monitoring the account activity in cooperation with the FBI's white-collar crimes unit. A text from my son-in-law to Claudia the previous evening read, "Locksmith confirmed for 8 a.m. Wear something you won't mind being photographed in." I was on the porch with my coffee at 7:55. His truck pulled up at 8:03. He had the locksmith with him, the same young man who wanted no part of whatever this was, evident from the way he kept his eyes on the ground. Claudia sat in the passenger seat for a moment before she got out. She had on a cream-colored blazer. She was composed in the particular way people get when they are concentrating very hard on maintaining a performance. My son-in-law walked up the driveway loose and easy, phone already raised. "We're here to execute the property transfer, Clifton. You don't have to make this any harder than it needs to be. Get your important documents, whatever you need for the next few weeks, and we'll arrange." "Just one moment," I said. I set my coffee down on the porch railing. Sitting on the porch table, next to my crossword book, was a portable Bluetooth speaker, the kind built for job sites, waterproof, loud enough to hear over power tools. I picked up my phone. I connected to the speaker. I opened the audio file from the back porch conversation. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. My daughter's voice came out of that speaker so clearly that the Hendersons, 4 doors down, turned to look. The couple walking their retriever on the sidewalk stopped mid-stride. The locksmith took a visible step backward. He is so far gone it's almost sad. My son-in-law's jaw went slack. Claudia's hand came up to her mouth. "We don't need to worry about any kind of contest. He couldn't put together a coherent legal challenge if someone handed him the paperwork and a pen. Turn that off." My son-in-law's voice came out wrong, too high, stripped of the easy confidence he'd walked up the driveway with. I did not turn it off. "If we make sure his prescription refills stop routing through the Charlotte pharmacy and switch them to a mail-order account we control, he'll run out of his cardiac medication within 6 weeks. At his age, with his history, nobody's going to ask a lot of questions. We'll be completely clear of any challenge before spring." The Hendersons were on their porch now. Mrs. Carmichael from across the street had opened her front door. A man walking past had stopped entirely and was staring. Claudia began to cry. Real crying this time, ugly and ragged, nothing like the careful kind from my kitchen table in May, the sound a person makes when the floor disappears beneath them. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was one of the most complete I have ever experienced on a residential street. From the far end of the block, moving at a steady pace, came 2 dark blue sedans and a white panel van. They parked along the curb in a clean line. The doors opened and 8 men and women stepped out. Some wore FBI windbreakers. 2 were in suits. One of the suits was Theron, who caught my eye from the sidewalk and gave a brief, businesslike nod. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s, short dark hair, the expression of someone who handles this before breakfast, addressed my son-in-law without preamble. She read his full name from a document in her hand. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, forged execution of legal instruments, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." My son-in-law did not remain silent. He said a number of things in rapid succession, most of them involving the word misunderstanding. He said them while an agent turned him by the shoulder and placed his hands behind his back. He was still talking when the handcuffs went on. Claudia had slid partway down against the front quarter panel of the truck. A second agent helped her to her feet and spoke to her in a low, measured voice. She was nodding, or trying to, her whole body shaking. She looked up at me from the driveway. I don't know what she was hoping to find on my face. Whatever it was, I don't think she found it. I walked down the porch steps and stopped about 10 feet from where she stood. "The house is still mine," I said, not loudly, just plainly. It was always still mine. The trust has held since 2020, and your husband filed every document against an asset he never had any legal access to. The deed is void. The wire transfers are being reversed. Every dollar is coming back. She shook her head, something desperate moving through her eyes. "Dad, I didn't know about the trust. I swear I didn't know." "You planned to let me run out of heart medication," I said. "You planned it in specific detail. You discussed the timeline, the pharmacy routing, the approximate number of weeks. The recording exists. The FBI has it. Whatever version of events you decide to build your defense around, it will need to account for your own voice describing the schedule of my death. She didn't have anything to say to that. The agent beside her put a hand on her arm. She didn't resist. I watched them put my daughter in the back of a federal sedan. I watched my son-in-law, still mid-sentence and handcuffed, be guided into a separate vehicle. I watched the locksmith practically sprint to his truck and pull away before anyone thought to ask him anything. The neighbors drifted back inside slowly. Theron came up the driveway and shook my hand and said we had a considerable amount of paperwork ahead of us and that I should eat something today. I went back up the porch steps. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, but I stood there with it anyway, looking at the dogwoods along the fence line. Barbara had chosen everyone, drove 40 minutes to the nursery, carried them home in the back of the old Bronco. They were still there. I took the mug inside and pulled the door shut behind me, and the lock caught with a sound as solid and final as anything I have ever heard.